Despite being a history buff and growing up steeped in the civil rights history and movement, spending half my time in church sanctuaries, and marches, and other half in multiple courtrooms, I never even noticed the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And I am almost ashamed to admit that before my first participation in the March for Life in January 2016, I probably could not tell you exactly where it was. So strange, because it seems that today is probably for me the most impressive landmark in the entire city. And I still remember the Palm Sunday in 2017, standing alone as the sole participant in the 40 Days for Life, standing vigil with the signature tape across my mouth was bound for life, as a family with 3 small children arrived at the steps of the court on a sunny Sunday afternoon, and recall the amazement and joy of those smiling children. In the vernacular of the age, I might say that it was the day that I became woke about the Supreme Court, despite having actually had the privilege to work as an intern on Capitol Hill, which is set right before it, and where the original chambers of the United States Supreme Court are actually located. It's a discordantly odd reflection because I have been returning to the nation's capital since before I can remember, and for my very first trip found our family staying at the very high-end hotel just north of the White House, when I had the privilege to accompany my father on a short walk to the West Wing, where he had an appointment to interview with a man about a very big job offer. And it was a very early glimpse of my father's deeply held convictions, because no visitor to the White House can not be awestruck and humbled by the splendor, beauty, majesty, and grace of the executive mansion and the power that it represents. Because he said, "Thank you very much, Mr. Haldeman. Give my warmest regards to the president." And we walked back to our nice hotel. But I have to admit that my daddy was a far bigger man than I, because I was happier than Forrest Gump on a Dr. Pepper binge in the White House. But all of the official government buildings of the nation's capital set it apart from other cities. And I recall a class trip back to Washington as a freshman in high school, sponsored by our physical education instructor, who happened to own a bus company. And despite having visited the city multiple times before, returning to Washington with Mr. Mulvihill introduced me to a Washington that I had never witnessed before, filled with rich stories of heritage and history, including a vignette about a French traveler to America, although not the one with whom most are familiar, but rather the designer of the Executive Office Building, located just behind the White House on 15th Street Northwest. The man was just a good architect who submitted a proposal for a government contract. And because he knew he was a great architect, he knew that whatever he would create would simply be magnificent. An impression reinforced when the contract was awarded. But according to Mr. Mulvihill, the man had never actually visited Washington until after his grand edifice had been completed. And as he walked along the streets of the marvelous new capital city, he began to feel overcome, not by wonder, but rather melancholy and sadness. And when he had completed his tour, we were told, he went straight to the building that he had created, went all the way to the top floor, and threw himself out the window, disappointed by how ugly his Gothic structure appeared, discordant with the symmetry of the rest of the capital of a new democracy. A tragic story with a very sad ending. Under 28 U.S.C. Section 455A and B, any justice, judge, or magistrate judge of the United States shall disqualify himself in any proceeding in which his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. He shall also disqualify himself where he has a personal bias or prejudice concerning a party, or personal knowledge of disputed evidentiary facts concerning the proceeding. And in the matter in Re Virginia Electric Power Company v. Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, a case heard by the Fourth Circuit in Richmond in 1976, a mere expectancy is an exercise in speculation, not actual and direct, and therefore fails to satisfy the threshold for determination of prejudice sufficient to mandate a judge's recusal. Yet, in the courts of the Commonwealth, an expansive view is taken, as the Congress pursued in the last impeachment case, granting a liberal construction to the terms high crimes and misdemeanors, suggesting that when the founders said high crimes and misdemeanors, they did not actually mean that one had to actually commit a crime, high or misdemeanor. And in a Wilson v. Commonwealth case, a Virginia case that was heard by the Court of Appeals in 2006, the court stated, according to the Canon 3A of the Canons of Judicial Conduct, a judge shall disqualify himself in any proceeding in which his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. And as noted in Davis v. Commonwealth, the requirement of this canon is clear. A judge must diligently avoid not only impropriety, but a reasonable appearance of impropriety as well. Exactly when a judge's impartiality might reasonably be called into question is a determination to be made by that judge in the exercise of his or her sound discretion. However, as noted in Commonwealth v. Jackson, while the canons may be helpful, the case law of the Commonwealth alone determines whether failure to recuse warrants reversal of a judgment. Thus, a purported violation of the canons alone is not enough to mandate recusal. Rather, the party moving for recusal has the burden of proving the judge's bias or prejudice. And in the absence of proof of actual bias, recusal is properly within the discretion of the trial judge. Yet, in the history of the United States Supreme Court, Samuel Chase, as in Chase Manhattan Bank in New York, is the only Supreme Court justice who was ever impeached in 1804, and he was acquitted by the Senate in 1805. And in September 2019, when the U.S. Senate was involved with the nomination of Justice Kavanaugh, the reporters at CNN reminded us, who may have forgotten from high school civics, that the process for impeachment of a United States Supreme Court justice is the same as for impeaching a president. The House needs only a simple majority to impeach a Supreme Court justice or any federal judge. To convict and then remove the justice or judge, the Senate requires a 2/3 majority. And in just 3 short days this week, after constant reminders of the dangers of the pandemic that have forced states to retreat from reopening and that threaten the reopening of schools on fear sparked by prognostications of doom about what might happen to our children and a coming wave of death, a Supreme Court story quickly emerged about an 87-year-old Supreme Court justice who had a history of serious health concerns dating back to 1999, over 2 decades ago. But miraculously, despite being transferred from Sibley Memorial in Washington to Johns Hopkins University Hospital in Baltimore, where she was expected to begin an extended stay after a confirmed diagnosis with a notorious pathogen that has instantly set off infections at choir rehearsals and killed over 30 senior faith leaders simply because they chanced to attend a religious convention in the town where their chances of catching a novel coronavirus were less than being involved in an automobile accident. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was immediately released and sent home to recover in quarantine. But amid questions about what would have had to have been a miracle in light of all of the panic created over a novel coronavirus, it was announced today that despite not being harmed at all by the deadly pathogen that has now killed over 130,000 Americans, over half of whom are no different from the senior jurist in age, she has been diagnosed with a recurrence of her liver cancer that has come back again, a cancer that actually works medically to degrade the immune system, which would have made her weaker. But there has been no explanation presented beyond pandering sympathy in an election year as to how she just happened to be so very, very lucky with everything that we have been told about a novel coronavirus weighing against her. A virus allegedly so deadly that when Chuck Woolery had his son found with that disease this week, he immediately recanted everything that he had formerly said against it and went further to close his Twitter account. And if these events don't raise the slightest inference of an appearance of impropriety, at a minimum, I don't know that anything else will. And in an election year where Speaker Pelosi has repeatedly reminded us that it is the president who threatens the American way of life and that democracy is at stake. My name is Major Mike Webb, and I am running for U.S. Congress. With liberty, honor, and excellence, by God, we shall make America great again. Honest. In the shelter of your care each day.
'cause I am a seeker and you are a keeper. You are a leader, won't you show me the way? You are.
This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.